So the NCCPE, we're really committed to contributing to an inclusive knowledge sector, and we're learning as we go, and we get things wrong, and we try and get things better and better, and we're working to really do that, to shape our organisation, how we work, how we engage in spaces, who we work with. But we also want to support others who are committed to contributing to an inclusive knowledge sector in terms of their practices, whether they're research organisations, teaching organisations, whether they're working in community settings or cultural settings. We really want to work together to say, well, what could this ecosystem look like? And we obviously are particularly focused on the role that universities may or may not play within building inclusive knowledges. It's been quite exciting time for us. We've launched a new website, we've launched a new vision, we're just about to embark on opening up conversations with you all to think about, well, what are our imagined futures for how inclusive knowledge organisations can work? And we want to think big, we want to think outside of the paradigms that are holding us back into new ways of thinking. And we're then really interested in, what are we doing now? What are the promising practices now that are going to help us get there? And we're going to be doing that over the next 18 months, and we really invite you to join us. And it's partly why we're focusing that on that during our conference. Now, some of you will remember that at our Online Engage conference, wave at me if you joined us at Online Engage in December. Brilliant, brilliant. You came back for more. That's a good sign. We talked about these kind of waves of change across the sector. This idea that around 2000, we were really interested as a sector in trusted and open research. And indeed, that laid the foundations for organisations like ours to begin. There was a really interesting, I think that's Paul telling me I'm speaking too long, you know, the introduction of looking at social and economic impact and the research excellence framework, a way of measuring and assessing universities' research work, which really helped us think about our practices. The rise of the civic agenda just before COVID and Brexit, we were talking about universities in their place and what the relationship they had with their other partners in that place. And then also, you really wanted me to stop? Oh, okay. I was like, this is a real unsubtle hinting, you know, like... In 2020, Welcome, we're doing some really interesting work around the culture of higher education and how that needed to change to be much more responsive and thoughtful in terms of the culture it was operating under. And then finally, this move towards inclusion and engagement and a much bigger focus on how do we become inclusive. And we think that we're really at a bit of a crossroads because we've got all this kind of momentum for engagement in the UK, but then we're also suffering from considerable economic challenges. You know, many of the communities that we work with are really struggling. Many of the publics that we're engaging with are struggling. And then our universities, they too are struggling and having to make really difficult decisions about where they put their money and their effort. And indeed, there are some profound cuts across the sector. Not only that, the government are a bit, you know, they put a lot of pressure on universities in terms of how they should work in society and their expectations, and commentators likewise. And then the public, many of the public research suggests, just don't have a connection with the university sector at all, or don't really understand what its value is. And so at this crossroads, we wanted to open a conversation with two amazing speakers. So Paul, why don't you introduce them?
Yeah, and it is this idea of at a crossroads, and we've got two amazing people to help us think about the future, I think. So can I invite Stephen and Rebecca to join me on stage? And gosh, what next, really? What do we do collectively to navigate these times that Sophie described so beautifully? You know, and I think one instinct is to just hunker down, to kind of really cut, and kind of really focus on business as usual and just try and get through. And the other, I think, is much harder, but it is to actually step back a bit and to think long term and to think, actually, what could we do to kind of prepare ourselves better for the future that's bearing down on us? So both Stephen and Rebecca are going to help us think about that. Stephen's going to reflect about his vision of the future, And Rebecca's going to draw on the amazing work that she's led at the Arts Council to build a really kind of inclusive set of projects that really open up art and culture. So it's going to be a real treat, I think. So our first speaker, Stephen, many of you will have met Stephen in previous conferences. He works for Research England, and Research England dispense a very large amount of money every year to help all of us do great research and engagement in universities. He's responsible for research policy. He is chair of the REF, the Research Excellence Framework Panel, and that distributes £2 billion a year to universities. But Stephen is not going to talk about the here and now. He's not going to talk about the hurly-burly of research policy and the REF. He's going to look beyond. He's going to look way into the future and offer a personal vision of how he sees the future for the university sector. So, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's great to be here, to see some old friends and hopefully meet some new friends too. So what Paul and Sophie have asked me to do is to think about what the university research system might look like in 2040. That's quite a challenging thing to do. 2040 is quite a long way ahead, and there are all manner of things that could happen in the research system between now and then. But perhaps it's more valid to ask the question about what do we want the research system to be in 2040? How do we want it to change? And what can we do? And how can we work now to realise that vision? So to help think about what we might want to happen by 2040, I thought it would be useful to go back an equivalent period of time to 2008 and just reflect a bit on what's happened since 2008. What were you doing in 2008? Where were you in 2008? Were you doing the same role that you're doing now? Were you in a different role? Maybe you were at university. Maybe some of you were at school. It feels like a long time ago, but when you reflect back on 2008, a lot has stayed the same. The funding landscape for research is actually remarkably similar to what it was in 2008, although perhaps a surprise, actually there's more money in research now than there was in 2008. It's actually a more buoyant system for research. Maybe it doesn't feel like that, but that's one of the changes since 2008. But let's look back to some of the things that were happening in 2008. Well, the Beacons for Public Engagement programme was being launched and the NCCPE was being created as part of that. So prior to 2008, there was no Engage conference. Can you imagine that? There was no Engage conference before 2008. There was a real sense in the sector that research needed to become more engaged, and Sophie's mentioned already some of the drivers of that. And over those 16 years, there's been a real step change in engagement. And there was a kind of midterm report in 2015, the Factors Affecting Public Engagement report, which was sponsored by a number of funders, kind of looked at the engagement at that point, 7 years on, and decided increased focus on bringing people more into shaping and developing research agendas. We see more in community engagement, and we see a much more heightened and mature sensitivity to issues of diversity and inclusion. But now there's still a sense that we need more engagement. So on one level we've moved on, but we still have that ambition to make our research system more engaged. 2008 also marks the initiation of what in the funding world we call the impact agenda. It's not like impact didn't exist before 2008, but there was a policy environment that appeared, pathways to impact statements in grants, some of you might remember those, and the evolution of impact in the REF, our national research evaluation. So it was introduced in the 2014 exercise and moved, I would say, to maturity in the 2021 exercise, although we do have plans to shift that agenda further in the next exercise. That has led to a dramatic change in the position of societal impact within universities. It's now an agenda that's talked about all the time within our universities. That wasn't the case in 2008. This is a transformation that has happened in 16 years. So I think my conclusion is that over 16 years there's been a considerable amount of change with a definite turn to more engaged research. And while that change can seem hard and fragile in the moment, when you look back over 16 years, what we collectively as a community have achieved is extraordinary. And I think we need to, and that's maybe something we need to really keep in our mind and celebrate over the next 2 days, is where we've come from and how much we've achieved. So we can look back and kind of get a sense of how much change can happen. Maybe we should also look at the present and say, what are the drivers that our sector and system are experiencing at the moment? Perhaps the biggest driver, which I think is alive to all of us, is a continued and increasing pressing need to address societal challenges and the central role that research and innovation plays in addressing those challenges. And that leads many of us to think that we need more action-oriented research. We need research that's about delivering change, not just delivering publications. That in turn means that there is this continued pressure for increasing engagement and co-creation with society, and an increasing focus on what's called transdisciplinary research, where teams are brought together that aren't just about researchers. They bring together diverse expertises from across society, and that knowledge and expertise is used in an integrated way collectively, and there aren't knowledge hierarchies within that. So that's one definite trend that we see, this pressing societal challenges. In the UK context, there's a really important driver which has already been mentioned, which is the financial pressure on the UKHE sector, which is creating all sorts of challenges in the universities that many of you work for. But I think it's important to think of that pressure not just in a negative way, but to ask what can we gain from this pressure? What are the positives that might come out of it? And I see already a pressure towards more collaboration between universities, potentially at local and regional levels. And I think this pressure to collaborate is being driven by financial pressures. And we're going to see, I think, a spectrum of responses from potentially full mergers of institutions through to more sharing of services and resources. And I wonder whether one of the things that might come out of that are regional engagement hubs, where engagement professionals, rather than working for a single university or a single other organisation in their region, they actually come together to be much more effective teams that are focused on that regional agenda, working with all of the knowledge partners in that area. And I think that's quite an interesting vision for the future, and one that might actually come out of some of the financial pressures that we're seeing. The financial pressures are also going to probably lead us to doing more research, less research in total as a nation. And so what that means is that we need to continue to focus our efforts on the research that is most impactful. If we're doing less, it has to be better research and more impactful research. Another trend that I think is going to be really important over the next 16 years is the development in the capabilities of artificial intelligence and robotics. And when you say that, people kind of roll their eyes and, yeah, it's the next big thing, but actually this is the next big thing. This is going to transform the way in which research is being done. The pace and capabilities of research are going to increase as researchers, not as AI replaces researchers, that's not going to happen, but as researchers do their work alongside intelligence systems that will support their activities. And that means that the people in research, the researchers, can become much more focused on the ideas and the concepts and the relationships that they need in order to deliver their research. So there's a real opportunity there. And then the fourth thing I just wanted to mention is there is already an increasing focus on people in the research system. It's reflected in our proposals for the next REF. this recognition that we need to pay some attention to the conditions in the research system that allow people to thrive. And there is now real change and transformation around that agenda. I'm not saying it's perfect yet by any means, but this has become a much more important question for universities and other research organisations over the last couple of years, and I think will be a big driver in the next few years. So what will research in universities look like in 2040? Well, I think this is a vision of the future, and it's not necessarily the one we're guaranteed to get, but it's one that I'd like us to work towards. So transdisciplinary research projects are the norm with engagement at their heart. That's not to say all research needs to be transdisciplinary and engaged. There's still a space for people pushing the frontiers of knowledge, but the bulk of our research, in my vision for the future, will become transdisciplinary and engaged. Research in universities will become increasingly clustered around societal challenges and not around academic disciplines, and that's a trend you can already see in many institutions. This change is coming. There are more and more cross and interdisciplinary units being set up whose focus is on addressing societal challenges. Research will depend on multidimensional teams integrating knowledges from a range of publics and stakeholders. That's kind of what transdisciplinary research is. And importantly in that, we need to eliminate knowledge hierarchies. We need to move away from the idea that there are some types of knowledge that are more valuable than others, and there are some stakeholders in the research system that are more valuable than others. And because of all of that, the primary outputs for research will be actionable knowledge, and there'll be a reduced focus on scholarly outputs. And writing that blockbuster paper will still be part of a researcher's life, but much less important, with a focus on what those actionable outcomes will be. So in 2040, we'll all be preparing, well, I say we, it won't be me, we'll be preparing for REF 2044. And what will REF 2044 look like? Well, engagement, impact, and research culture will actually form the bulk of the assessment. So, in 29, we're reducing scholarly outputs to 50%. My prediction is that that will get lower, and we'll focus more and more on engagement and impact. Many universities will be taking advantage of new mechanisms that we've put into the REF to reward and incentivize collaboration, and collaboration will be the key metric by which universities judge themselves, whether that's collaborating with their local partners or whether it's collaborating with all sorts of people and communities to deliver the research that they need. Traditional research outputs won't be a very big part of the assessment, if part of the assessment at all. And there will be focus on the teams that universities build, and that as being a measure of their success in research. So REF 2044 will look a bit different from the current REF, but I hope you can see how the current REF and its proposals around people, culture and environment, its addition of engagement to the impact agenda is actually, hopefully, paving the way for some of the change that I think we all want to see. Thank you very much.
Well, what about that as a vision for the future? We're just going to give you a couple of minutes just to react. Maybe just think yourself, chat to your neighbour. What did you make of what Stephen had to say? And if you'd like to think about a question, no pressure, but if you would, then this is the Menti code. So just a couple of minutes to react. Now, we're going to change sector. We're going to leave the hallowed walls of the university sector, and we're going to enter the playful world of arts and culture. And we're going to be given, I think, a really helpful way of contextualizing the kind of ambition that Stephen articulated so beautifully. And Rebecca is going to share with us some of the lessons she's learned. She's National Director of Engagement and Communities. What a great job title at the Arts Council. And she's worked there for over 10 years. And she started as an education and learning officer. And what a wonderfully meandering career you've had, Rebecca, that many people in this room will probably kind of recognise and empathise with. But before that, you were an actor and a teacher in various theatre companies. You worked as a project leader for an NHS advice service. And before that was an English and drama teacher in London. And so I think you know a thing or two about engagement. And before Rebecca speaks, we thought it might be really helpful to just show you a very short film that lays out the Arts Council England's current 10-year strategy. It's called Let's Create, and I think it creates a nice context to enter into Rebecca's world. So can we just play that film, please, Sam?
Let's create a country united by culture to be happier, healthier, excited, inspired, to make sense of our world, sense of ourselves, comforting the lonely, helping kids become grown-ups and grown-ups become kids again. Bringing us all together with the freedom to ask difficult questions and take a stand, to make your mark and make a difference, where your age, your colour and your bank balance don't matter, where it's about who you are, not where you're from, about what you do, not what you can't. For the change the worlders and the just for funners, the kids with ambition and the ambitious with kids. In villages, towns and cities, in playgrounds and packed concert halls, in rooms above pubs and festivals in fields, playing to crowds of thousands and audiences of one. Now, let's create.
Thank you, Rebecca.
So thank you for inviting me to speak. I've been asked to talk about Arts Council England's Creative People and Places programme and what we are trying to address, what challenges, impact learning, and maybe where we go next. So hopefully some of it will be transferable to all your different contexts, but I hope you find something from this useful. So I think there's two distinct strands of learning going on. There's learning for partners and communities delivering in place, and there's been learning for the Arts Council in terms of approach and policy. So the approach of the individual, and I'm going to call them CPP for Creative People and Places, hope that's all right, CPP projects wasn't necessarily new. But I think bringing it into a single national programme and the architecture of how it was done was pretty new for the Arts Council. So what were we trying to address? So in order to talk about what we've learned, it's useful to set out what we were trying to achieve. As a development agency, we take active steps to try and understand where there are gaps and where we can, how we can approach them to explore that. So when we set this programme up, we had a strategy called Great Art for Everyone. But the evidence showed us that we weren't reaching everyone. And the map that you can see on the right shows in the brown shaded parts the local authority areas in the bottom 20% of engagement in arts at that time, according to an average of the Active People Survey, which was happening at that time. And you can see these are predominantly, but not exclusively, in the North and the Midlands. And the red dots show our national portfolio organisations mapped against that. And the bigger the dot, the bigger the amount of money was that those organisations got. It's not a binary thing, but it's useful context. And CPP represented for us the first arts programme which was evidence-based in terms of who it was trying to reach, and it was explicitly focused on the two key metrics of engagement and excellence in places where audience engagement had historically been below average. So, that worked. Next slide, please. So fundamentally, we were after three things. It was more people from least engaged places engaging in arts and culture, and that the process of engagement, as well as the quality of the cultural offer, was excellent, and that we learned stuff about what does and doesn't work through an action research approach. And as well as only the least engaged places being eligible, there were some other things that were new for Arts Council too. And one of those was community decision-making. Empowering the public to shape the programme has been fundamental to creative people and places. And we don't expect it to happen overnight, but we do expect an authentic approach and commitment to this, and we ask for the methodology of how CPPs plan to empower the public. And we interviewed people about it as part of our decision-making process. We also said it had to be delivered by consortia, which must include community representation and cultural representation. And finally, it's a developmental programme. We wanted it to be asset-based, and we know change takes time, so we asked for a 10-year vision. And I'm going to try and illustrate some of this through project examples, because otherwise I think it can sound a little bit dry. So next slide, please. So the right questions, accompanied by radical listening, foster deeper community engagement, asking what's important to communities, what matters, what change is desired. We learnt that the sometimes alienating language of arts and culture can hinder initial engagement, so it's essential to begin with community needs and outcomes and concerns. In St Helens, a town often defined by a set of negative statistics, whether it's high suicide rates or poor health outcomes, the programme didn't start by talking about art, but by exploring with people through arts and culture what it was they wanted to change about the place where they live. They didn't have many venues, so they turned the whole town into an art centre. They developed their own bugle call rung out from the top of car parks. They ran an interactive public art project to rename a civic park, asking the community which local hero should it be named after. And it got people talking about what's important, who's important to St Helens. After 500 submissions, it was called Vera Page Park, after a local woman who'd grown up in care. Now, her name is now part of the town's fabric. It's on maps, it's in signage. And they discovered also that men in the least deprived wards in St Helens had a 10-year shorter life expectancy than men in the least deprived wards. So artist Mark Storer is undertaking a 12-year residency in those communities to outlive that statistic. Next slide, please. 2 years into the project, Storer led workshops with a group of older men who in this post-industrial town metaphorically described themselves as on the scrap heap. Together, they reimagined themselves as mythical figures in this incredible photographic exhibition entitled The Council of Wisdom, which demanded that their social value and experience is acknowledged. Next slide, please. It's another member of the Council of Wisdom, and the starting point really was who they were, what assets they bring, and how they saw themselves. And this guy, John, he spent a lot of time on his allotment. That was what was really important to him. Next slide, please. And here's the Council of Wisdom, and I suppose the metaphor here is in all their power. Next slide, please. In the same project, he worked with school children, asking the question, what should it be like to grow up in St Helens? And the culmination of this project is a day in September. It's kind of live art event, and school children walk through the town handing out poses, free poses to bemused but delighted residents. And at lunchtime, Police Sergeant Pope is giving out free food in the chippy because 26% of children in St Helens are growing up in poverty. Next slide, please. And the day ends, also previous slide, I'm gone forward too quickly. And the day ends as the Army of Beauty, as Storer terms the school children, flanked by flower-adorned police horses and the Council of Wisdom. They march silently on the town hall and they unfurl a banner of what it should be like to grow up in St Helens. And that forms the foundation of a children's charter for the town, and it's adopted by the town council. Next slide, please. In another example, in Doncaster, they've been working with residents on the Balby Bridge estate. Now, I understand that the Balby Bridge estate is the 55th most deprived area in England, and it was built in the 60s, and it's surrounded by a dual carriageway, and it's usually viewed from the outside. And the only way in and out that's not across the big road is a footbridge that fell down and was never rebuilt. It's got a negative reputation in the press. Some people won't go there, and we're told that some people who live there think less of themselves. But it's a very mixed community, and it actually has quite a lot of assets. It's got a primary school where 28 languages are spoken, a Quaker meeting house, a deaf club, a master learning disability group, a family hub. And partnerships with people like those are integral to CPP. And I know many of you will be aware of the way working with partners can reach communities that we don't otherwise have access to. And we've got many housing associations, like we work with on this project in CPP, but numerous other unusual partners that I haven't got time to mention, but can share later. Next slide, please. Here in Balby Bridge, the CPP team are delivering a 3-year programme on the estate to get to know people on a deeper level so they can build trust and co-create further cultural programmes. And in the first project, artist Jamie Bubb, who happened to be from the area, has been working with the groups I mentioned and speaking to residents over the course of a year. Next slide, please. In the project, 100 Faces of Balby Bridge, he invites people to come and have a photographic portrait taken, and a group of young people become the lighting crew, and he asks sitters to bring an item that's important to them. And they control how the image should look. They even press the clicker, and these are some of the images. Next slide. And next slide. And next slide, please. This particular image is of a refugee who attends the Conversation Club on the estate. He was a farmer in his home country, and he hopes to be so again. And he spent time curating his plants into his image and with a green filter to represent his love of nature. But the project's no longer called the 100 Faces of Balby Bridge because over 200 people came forward. Next slide, please. So, in other learning, the consortium approach was new for us. We learnt with the right governance in place, with common goals and values, success usually follows. And we clarified early on that local authorities couldn't take the lead. We wanted to directly empower communities. Local authorities are crucial allies in empowering communities, but by not being local authority-led, additional funding avenues like charitable trusts become accessible. Managing conflicts of interest, or a perception of conflicts of interest, turned out to be crucial. Thinking about transition phases from application to implementation, that can be helpful. A group who come together to apply for our CPP programme generally won't be the group who deliver, and they don't always realise that. Establishing the consortia and dedicated delivery teams requires dedicated time and setup phase. Flexibility is key. Consortia might evolve as challenges arise, changes in leadership occur for all the above reasons, or misconceptions about the project scope. But we see these experiences as valuable learning experiences, and we're exploring how we can apply action learning to governance models as well. Peer learning, it's a condition that all programmes take part in peer learning. Part of this includes action learning sets for all of the CPP directors. And that commitment, including reflecting on what doesn't work, has been crucial to the impact and supported the programme's ability to influence sectoral thinking. We've also tried to be really clear that it's okay to fail too, as long as we're learning from it. And we've recently expanded our peer learning programme to include a wider cohort of programmes and share learning even more widely. Leadership, CPP has just been described as multiplying leadership. It's not unique, but it is part of a rising tide of progressive approaches that create more open, collaborative approaches, characterised, I think, by values and purpose-driven leadership that builds trust and, crucially, shares control. Next slide, please. And I also just want to address head-on those questions about excellence that routinely raise their head on programmes like this. In the cultural world, perceptions of excellence have been shaped by hierarchies which privilege certain artistic practices over others. But we would argue it's not a binary thing, that somehow because it's community-focused, it can't be excellent. Sometimes the work is about participation. Sometimes it's about bringing work into a place, and both can be excellent. It's what the community wants. And people don't know what they don't know, so CPPs offer multiple entry points, including Go and Sees, which build confidence and understanding. And they've also learned that taking time to discuss what each group or place means by quality can really help. In many CPPs, communities are on commissioning panels, and often that includes selecting artists for their particular fit with an opportunity, rather than their status as artists, because that might not mean very much at all to people who haven't previously engaged. And we use our Impact and Insight toolkit to help us look at excellence, and the core dimensions of that survey measure how far CPP audiences agree with sets of statements around artistic distinctiveness, rigour, local impact, relevance and cultural contribution. And we also use questions to measure the process of engagement too. How far CPP's participants feel that they were involved in the process, whether their voice was heard, whether they felt they had the power to shape the project. And early findings are suggesting CPP comes out better than average on all those benchmarks. But even on the more traditional metrics, there are numerous examples, from opera on the streets to European festivals to programmes going out to Venice Architecture Biennale and working with the European Space Agency, which I'd love to tell you about, but I haven't got time. Next slide, please. So, what's the learning for us in terms of policy? One of the most powerful things about CPP is that it has been a national programme. It's given it a profile and an ability to influence that it wouldn't otherwise have. It's allowed us to collect wider data, so we can tell both a national and a local story. And it's not the first time this work has happened. I bet loads of you are doing work like this, but it's really shone a light on it. And that has been remarkable in its ability to transform the cultural landscape. People have engaged in it over 14 million times, and 89% of those people are from the low and medium engaged groups, and the biggest proportion of that is from the very least engaged groups. We explicitly took an asset-based approach, so we never overloaded the programme with lots of other social outcomes. We wanted the programme to be arts and culture-led, and for the community to decide where the focus should be, because we trusted that good outcomes will follow, because we know how the arts works, and they do. Consortium governance has been hard at times, but it's not immune from conflicts of personalities. Everything takes time. Sometimes we want to rush. And CPP has supported new infrastructure in places where there wasn't any previously. We've got new national portfolio organisations, regular festivals that all emerged from creative people and places. That can only happen when you think long term and you've got longer term funding. And when you open doors, inevitably, some of those people end up pursuing creative careers. They include people who've gone on to become, and never thought they would, but become curators, woodcarvers, producers, performers, workshop leaders, citizen journalists. There's loads of others. And all through this, in their sharing of ideas and experiences and the identity the CPPs have as a national group, as a movement almost, has been extraordinarily powerful. Next slide, please. So what's next? Arts Council, Creative People and Places is now part of Arts Council England's national portfolio. It's played its part in influencing the 10-year strategy that you saw there, Let's Create. And we're just extending the programmes for a further year, and later this year we publish the guidance for the next 3-year programme with a much larger number of eligible places. And the number we will bring in will, of course, depend on the budget, which will be set by our National Council. It's a shifting environment, though. There's a public body review happening for the Arts Council. There's an upcoming election. Who knows what changes all these things bring? It's a progressive programme that has brought real change, but the landscape it works in can vary, of course, in its openness. So I must say there's been incredible support from Arts Council at the most senior level for this programme. We believe this approach, as one of many, will help us deliver on our 10-year strategy, Let's Create, where the creativity of everyone, regardless of where they live, is given the opportunity to flourish, and that everyone has access to this remarkable range of cultural opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today for Engage 2024, Day 1. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. We're looking forward to seeing you again tomorrow. And for more conversation, more amazing plenaries, more discussion and more conversation about the future of public engagement. So please join us tomorrow for day 2.